Let's get back to our constitutional discussion now. How do you interpret the Constitution? What does it all mean? Well, we get the original intent gang, obscurantists, and they come and say, well, we have to be fundamentalists. We have to go back and figure out things that are not in the approved text that was actually voted on, but the opinions eructated at different points by different people in different settings, and you try to make a compilation of those. This is essentially applying the method of Calvinism or Lutheranism to the Constitution. It's a kind of textual fundamentalism. In reality, you've got to read the Constitution in the light of natural law. Yes, natural law. Leftists don't want to hear that. So here we're attacking both. Natural law indicates that human society has certain needs. The preamble to the Constitution tries to sum these up, and you know it, and I just have to remind you, the General Welfare Clause looms large at the present time. At other times in history, it may be the Common Defense or the More Perfect Union. I guess all of them are under attack today. To construe the Constitution, you don't go back and look and say, what did John Q. Joe Blow say in 1702 in some debate? But you've got to basically make sense out of this from the point of view of the needs of a human society, and we know what those are. A rising standard of living, increased production, defense of human rights rooted in those, the ability of the individual to contribute, and not the fundamentalism of, say, a Calvin, because that is what's being done. It's the same approach that these people have to religious texts they then try to apply to the Constitution. In terms of the debate about the powers of the central government, well, we know Jefferson, right? Jefferson says, well, there are these enumerated powers, and that's all there are, and that's all you can do. Now, this ignores, interestingly enough, the text itself, because when we get to Article 1, Section 8, what are the powers of Congress? We got to look at number 18, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying it into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. That's the so-called elastic clause. That means when it comes to establishing a more perfect union, establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, ensuring the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18 says, you've got to make all the laws that are necessary and proper to do that. Now, that gets you out of the realm of pure textualism and into the area saying, well, what is necessary and proper in that regard? Now, the main debates were, should there be internal improvements paid for at public expense? Yes. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Erie Canal, the National Road, all of these internal improvements are indispensable. And, of course, the planter interest championed by Jefferson said, no, we don't want to pay. We don't care about a nation. We don't want to be taxed. That's one. The second thing is the Bank of the United States. Hamilton says yes. Jefferson says no. Thank God Hamilton won the day. Without this, the United States would have collapsed. It would have been a gone goose. And then the third one is the control of the currency and the protective tariff. And the protective tariff in 1862, the moral tariff, is the absolute precondition for the industrialization and progress of the country. And don't just say that it's only the bankers and only the industrialists that benefit from a protective tariff. The rising standard of living of farmers is based on mechanization and industrialization, as well as the availability of infrastructure so they can get their crops to market. So the Hamilton program is actually a better program for the farmer than the Jefferson one, although it may not seem so in the very, very short term. Now, the Hamilton argument, which I espouse, says that Jefferson is wrong. We can see Jefferson is wrong in practice. When he gets to the question of the Louisiana Purchase, right, in 1803, he sends, he's got Livingston over there in Paris, and then he sends over, I guess it's James Monroe, and Talleyrand, speaking for Napoleon, says to him, well, what do you give me for all of Louisiana? And they say, we'll give you $15 million. And Jefferson then has a crisis of conscience. Dare I go beyond the enumerated powers? Yeah, every time you want to do something important and valuable, you're going to have to think about something beyond just this pedantic list of the enumerated powers. You're going to get into the necessary and proper area, and that was to create a more perfect union by sort of filling it out. So Jefferson's doctrine is bankrupt in practice in his own life. How about the Grab Me, the Embargo Act, 21 December 1807? He cuts off all U.S. trade with all of Europe, with everybody in Europe, the British side and the Napoleon side. Where's the basis for that in the enumerated powers? Is it a war measure? There's no war. He's regulating commerce, yeah, but he's shutting it down completely. So the failure of the Jeffersonian program is obvious even from the guy's own career. Now let's look at the other side. Governments have inherent powers. Any national state has to provide for its own national independence and sovereignty. It's got to do what's necessary and proper for that. It's got to have self-defense. Self-defense implies an economy, an industrial base. Necessary and proper comes in there. It's got to have economic development. Without economic development, human societies collapse. Simple enough. Realize economic development or collapse. Go to hell. Those are the alternatives. So we choose economic development. And in order to make that understandable to individuals, you've got to have a rising standard of living, and you've got to aim at full employment. Those are some of the inherent powers of a government. But then there are also the implied powers. Back to them for a second. On this, we have the argument from Hamilton, and I would also stress the very eloquent version of this coming from the great John Marshall of Virginia, the Chief Justice of the United States from 1801 to 1835, and one of the greatest nationalists we've ever had. It's the nationalists against the states' rights people. The states' rights people happen to be the slave drivers and slavocrats of the Confederacy, and that's what it leads to. But even in their own Confederate experience, they find that their doctrine of states' rights won't work. In other words, they become, as time goes on, more and more like a military dictatorship of Robert E. Lee. Anyway, the famous case, McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819. State of Maryland attempts to tax Hamilton's Bank of the United States out of existence, and Marshall says, no, you can't do that. And he enunciates, in the best short form, the Hamilton doctrine of implied powers, and I'll quote it to you from the decision. This is John Marshall, McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, and I quote, let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but are consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. So the power to tax is the power to destroy. Maryland is not allowed to destroy the Bank of the United States. The Constitution is not a creature of the states. The reverse. The states are simply appropriate, convenient, traditional ways to organize the territory of the United States. They are not irreducible building blocks. We could organize this some other way. The secession of West Virginia from Virginia shows, as a concrete example, that sometimes states have to be altered. Don't want to do it except if necessary. So Marshall says, the government of the Union is emphatically and truly a government of the people. In form and in substance, it emanates from them. Its powers are granted by them. They are exercised upon them and for their benefit. If any one proposition could command the universal consent of mankind, we expect that it would be this, that the government of the Union, though limited in its powers, is supreme within its sphere of action. That is the nationalist program. And ultimately, that is what makes the United States a successful state. So the whole aesthetic, this whole fife and drum corps, three-corner hat, 1776 founding fathers, is great as far as it goes, but not when it basically says the Civil War never happened, industrialization and the protective tariff never happened, all this free market baloney. The United States thrived with a Bank of the United States in the first three decades or so. After that, from Jackson to the Civil War, we don't thrive. We drift towards the abyss. And after that, from 1862 into the 1930s, a protective tariff. So you look at American history, the majority of American history, there's no free market whatsoever. It's virtually, well, there is no free market anyway, but even in terms of the obvious stuff, it's clear that there is none. So don't go back before the Civil War. You've got to factor in the Civil War, industrialization, the progressive era, the good part, not the bad part. You've got to factor in the New Deal. You've got to factor in the Civil Rights Movement and the New Frontier and the Great Society. And then you get to something that makes sense today. So don't be a reactionary. Use your head and join the Hamilton-Marshall nationalist position. And we'll see you next week here on World Crisis Radio.